Here in DraftSharks Studios in Rochester, New York. Welcome to the DraftSharks podcast. I'm your host, Matt Schaff. With me, as always, is Jared Smolin. Joining us today for episode 3 in the What I Got Wrong series is Mike Tagliere, an analyst for Fantasy Pros, one of the co-hosts of the Fantasy Pros football podcast. Mike, thanks very much for joining us today.
Oh, no, of course. Thanks for having me, guys. I mean, this is the time of the year where I actually love it because I'm able to hop on a bunch of different podcasts and do different things that in season, it's really difficult. You know, we all have crazy schedules. Jared's hopped on our show a couple times and I'm always gracious of that because I know in season how much of a grind it could be, especially with a newborn and all that stuff. So it's going to be fun talking to you guys.
Well, I was all set to ask you about kind of taking it easier in the off season now that we're past football season, but you told us right before the show that you've actually got a move coming up, so it might get busier for you now, huh?
It's weird though. I mean, I think that's the one thing that you don't realize once you're, when you're not in the industry full time, you're like, oh, I'm going to have so much time to do whatever I want. I'm going to be able to research this that I wanted to do. And it leads you down a rabbit hole because you find one thing and you're like, oh, whoa, wait, what if I do a spreadsheet on that? And then you do that and that and that. So in season, I basically abandoned college football. I don't watch college football because Saturday is the one day of the week where I tell my wife I'll be a dad, I'll be a husband, I'll do like family things. So now I'm catching up on all the college stuff, trying to get ready to like the big boards and the mock drafts. And then we have free agency in March, and then the draft in April. And it's like May and June and July is typically the area where, okay, it's a little bit calm before the storm. And that's basically when we're trying to figure out a move across states, like that coincides with a football schedule. It's not great. I'm not going to lie. It's actually a pretty tough thing to do. People have actually talked to me about the birth of my son. They're like, did you plan that so that he wouldn't be born during the season? And I was like, I have no comment on such things, but we have more time to do other things in other months, but it's still kind of the busy season. But again, we do have a little bit more free time to be able to do shows with some of the places that we don't necessarily get to all the time. So again, I always look forward to this time of the year.
Yeah, it still makes me angry that Jared didn't plan better than having his daughter in September last season.
Jared, you gotta plan that stuff, man.
Yeah, that worked great. It worked great. My wife was home. She had her 3 months. Now she's back to work. I'm less busy, so I'm on daddy daycare duty.
That's true. I did notice recently, Mike, that last summer you were pushing Aaron Rodgers as an MVP bet for the then coming season, which obviously worked out. Have you had some time to bask in that? And did that carry over into any extra Aaron Rodgers exposure for you in fantasy?
So, what's weird is like we did our show on the Fantasy Pro show. We did it where we talked about our hits and misses from the season. And Dan will brag for me sometimes because he wants me to do it, but I hate taking those victory laps. You'll never see me go on Twitter and be like, this is right, this is right, this is right, this is right, because a player has 1 or 2 good games or whatever. It's more about like, that's my job to try and figure out when those things are going to happen and predict them, before the majority of the public does. The biggest thing, that's why I loved about this show and you invited me on, it's like, let's talk about those misses, because those are the things that I take, like, that's a problem I have where it's like, I'm going to be agonizing over it for the next couple months, trying to figure out what went wrong. What can I learn from? Was it an outlier? Because sometimes you're going to miss and the process was correct. Like say, one of the guys we're going to talk about today, AJ Green, he's a guy that if you were to go back before draft season and tell people AJ Green is going to play all 16 games, he's going to be on the field. Joe Burrow is going to be everything pretty much we thought he'd be. And AJ Green is going to be top 10 in the NFL in air yards. Where would you draft AJ Green? People would have been drafting him as a top 24 wide receiver. That much I do know, because when AJ Green's been on the field, he's been extremely productive. But unfortunately, it's one of those things that, you go back and you try and learn from and you say, all right, what could I have learned from this? And it's, that AJ Green was away from the football for an entire year, that the Bengals were very shoddy about injury history and things like that, and not telling us the truth about what they were going to do with him. But like I said, I love going back and trying to figure out those missing pieces and saying, all right, how can I apply this to the next player? Because there's always going to be a next player that you're wondering about for the following year.
Mm-hmm. So since you did bring up AJ Green, and I mean, obviously he's a miss wherever you took him at this point in hindsight, but considering that we didn't have to actually invest that much to get him, is he the kind of player that right now you're really kicking yourself about and that he's going to change much for you going forward? Or is he just kind of a risk that you knew you were taking in round 7, round 8, that's still the kind of risk that you're okay with taking going forward?
I would absolutely. That's a risk that I'd probably take again, just because of where he was being drafted. And that was one of the things I said, because I wrote an article basically saying my must-have players for 2020. He was on that list, and I said it's not because I must have him and I'm going to draft him in the 4th or 5th round. It's because of where you're drafting him. You can miss on players in the mid rounds. You can miss on players in the 5th or 6th round. You can't miss those top tier picks. You can't miss those ones that are locked in starters every single week. Your top 2 running backs, your top 2 wide receivers, those guys you need. Everything else is kind of mix and match. And AJ Green, getting him in the 7th or 8th round where he was going in drafts, he even dropped a little bit further once he had that preseason or the training camp little mishap or whatever it was. He dropped a little bit more in rankings where it was like you were getting him in the 9th round sometimes. That's a risk I'm willing to take. We've seen that guy produce at a high level throughout his career. I do the series. It's called Boom, Bust, and Everything in Between. And I've gone back to 2000, tracked every player's game in terms of the fantasy points they scored, what it meant that year. Because, 15 PPR points this year would have been a wide receiver 2 performance. But if you go back to a different year, it may have been a wide receiver 1. But basically I go through and track all those, right? And there was only 5 players since 2000 that produced wide receiver 2 or better numbers than AJ Green over the course of their career. So it was like I was banking on a wide receiver who had been there. He'd done that. Yes, he had a year off football, but the circumstances were getting better. And Zach Taylor's offense, they knew the offense a little bit more. They were getting Jonah Williams back. They had Joe Mixon. It seemed like they figured out how to use him. T. Higgins was a rookie. T. Higgins, that was one of the things. It's like it was a miss because I felt like, a lot of these rookie wide receivers, I don't think people talk about it enough this year about what these guys did, because they went from, wide receivers were always a project. It was a 3rd-year breakout wide receiver. That's what we always used to talk about. And nowadays, it's like we expect the guy to walk into the league and dominate right away because we're seeing guys like DK Metcalf, AJ Brown. These guys just walk in, Justin Jefferson, be studs right out the gate. And knowing that Justin Jefferson, T. Higgins, these guys did it without an offseason, without any preseason games, it's kind of ridiculous. So, I did not expect T. Higgins to walk in. I felt like he was AJ Green's eventual replacement in the lineup. I did like Tyler Boyd as well. But if I go back and talk about AJ Green, if I find another player like that I can have in the 9th round or whatever, I'll take that shot again, especially knowing the usage he got. It's just, unfortunately, AJ Green seemed to fall off a cliff. Maybe you're a bit more cautious with players that are aging, coming off a year-long injury, but at the same time, again, if you get a wide receiver that's top 10 in air yards, it's extremely rare you're going to see that guy finish outside the top 30 wide receivers.
Yeah, I think among all the misses we've talked about so far, I think AJ Green is like the best miss when you consider where he was going in drafts. I still think his price was, much more heavily weighed towards the downside. And we obviously got the downside. But even then, drafting AJ Green in the 8th or 9th round didn't kill your fantasy season. And there are, the way his season went, it could have played out where he was a top 24 wide receiver if he just connects on, as you said, like some more of those air yards. The process was right as far as the Bengals offense taking a step forward with Joe Burrow. Tyler Boyd and T. Higgins were 2 hits on that team. So I think the process was fine with AJ Green. We mentioned, we talked about T.Y. Hilton on the show with Mike Clay. I think he was similar, an aging guy who was coming at a discount that had opportunity for big target share. I think, those types of guys, they're fine to take shots on if you can get them in the 8th, 9th, 10th rounds.
Yeah, I think for me, T. Higgins is the more kick yourself player than AJ Green, in that I knew I really liked Joe Burrow heading in. I knew that I saw upside in the Bengals offense, and I knew that there was some risk to AJ Green. So wrapping all that in with being able to get T. Higgins late, and you don't have to plant a flag to take somebody in round 12 or round 13 more often than you did. It's just getting some exposure to that guy. That's the kind of player that I really need to, see the what if on a little bit more going forward, is get some T. Higgins in there just in case something happens that I can't project with my numbers on the spreadsheet heading in.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it wasn't even just AJ Green. You had John Ross, a guy that was supposed to be the field stretcher that was coming into the year healthy. You had Tyler Boyd. And that was where I liked T. Higgins. When I scouted T. Higgins, I didn't think that he popped off the page as an athlete or anything like that. But my description of him was that everything he does on a football field, he kind of makes it look easy. There's guys that just kind of go through the motions. Jamar Chase is that guy. Jamar Chase, he doesn't look like he's trying too hard, but he just continually gets it done. And you're like, how does he do it? And he's just a natural. And T. Higgins was that player. And that's why T. Higgins in Dynasty, I liked him a lot. But it was more like, I don't see how he gets in the field, because if you line him up opposite AJ Green, you have a similar player, right? Like, I'm not saying they're the same player, but a similar type player, whereas John Ross was the field stretcher, AJ Green would be the possession style receiver, and then you have Tyler Boyd playing his role over the middle. So I didn't know how he got on the field unless they went to like a 4 wide receiver set. And even then, Auden Tate was somebody that they played last year, and he played pretty well. So there's so many things going against T. Higgins this year. So to do what he did and, finish as I think he was a top 25 wide receiver this year, I went back and in my rankings for 2021, I have T. Higgins as I think my wide receiver 16. And I think a lot of people are telling me that I'm too high on him, but I really don't feel that way. AJ Green's going to be gone. John Ross is obviously not, he's a non-factor right now. They have to fix that offensive line. They have a lot of holes on defense where that team, they're not going to add a wide receiver of significance, I don't think. So T. Higgins, ever since he became a starter in that offense with Joe Burrow, they played 8 games together. In those 8 games, T. Higgins was, I think, the wide receiver 12 during that time. So yeah, I'm with you. I will invest in T. Higgins next year. His ECR right now, I want to say is like 23. It's far too low.
Yeah, love T. Higgins. My only question with him in 2021 is if Burrow's going to be ready for week 1. I mean,
yes.
If he is, I think it's, all systems go for Higgins. Just going back to last season, I think, the Green Higgins at cost, that would have been a good situation to draft both those guys and say, I can get AJ Green around 8. And if he doesn't hit, it's likely T. Higgins is going to have a strong season and, he's worth a pick in the 12th round or whatever.
Yeah, it's a good call.
And it's also one of those things where it's kind of a best ball development in that you want to stack players on a best ball team, but you can also carry it over to standard lineup setting redraft where you can stack those players and have that insurance policy behind AJ Green.
Well, the only issue that I think you would have had with Green and Higgins this year, I just tried to do this mental acrobats going back to the beginning, week 1 and week 2. So Higgins didn't even play. So I think if you did draft them both, I think you might be stuck in between a rock and a hard place because Higgins didn't really play in week 1. So if you drafted him in the 13th, 14th round or whatever, you probably would have dropped him for that first waiver wire pickup of the year, which really sucks but again, you weren't seeing him play snaps and you saw him get those when AJ Green, I think it was after 2 weeks, AJ Green basically started to lose a few snaps and then Higgins slowly gained. And I think by week 4, he was a full-time starter. Yeah. So it would have been it was a tough one to project for sure. I mean, Justin Jefferson's a similar prospect in terms of a guy I loved out of LSU, but I didn't draft him very high this year. I'm not going to lie about it in redraft leagues because he was a guy that during the training camp that they got was basically a month long. He was away from the team for 2.5 weeks with the COVID. Yeah. He was put on the COVID list, so he was out. So I was and then they started talking about he's not impressing, that they expected more. And I'm all these things are negative. The team only threw the ball 400 something times the year before. Adam Thielen's healthy. I like Jefferson, but I don't know if this is it. And then the defense started falling apart. They started throwing the ball more and Justin Jefferson took off. I mean, that dude, again, another guy in 2021, I'm willing to invest a top 10 wide receiver pick on that guy. He's a superstar. But yeah, it's a similar process. I guess this is going outside the box here because these weren't guys that I technically missed on, but I did ultimately because I did not want to draft rookie wide receivers because of the whole situation with no preseason and no reps with the team. But again, these guys just shined when most rookie wide receivers just don't.
I think one of the dilemmas that we probably have as fantasy analysts is when you are high on a guy, but you can't really see the clear path for him to get the opportunity that he needs to produce. I can remember from back in the early 2000s when I was just doing a newspaper column, I had Clinton Portis heading into his rookie season with the Broncos, and I was all set to make him one of my 3 sleepers. And then I heard that he was not going to start over Olandis Gary to open the season. So I'm oh, crap, I guess I don't want to make a sleeper out of a running back who's not even starting. So I took him out, put in William Jackson, the wide receiver for the Falcons at the time. Obviously, he did absolutely nothing, which is why anybody who's watching probably doesn't remember who William Jackson was. So it doesn't mean that you always stick to your guns because always sticking to your guns is going to make you wrong sometimes. But, there are times and you take the draft price in as a factor that you do just stick to it and you say, I don't know exactly how it's going to happen, but if you can get this guy late enough, something definitely can happen. Have a little patience. You might have a league winner out of him.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's so tough because we know that volume fuels all this stuff. I mean, that's more important than anything else. So when you're doing projections, you need to be able to find volume for guys, but I think we do need to be able to take that leap and say, this guy's so talented that even if we can't project volume right away, or even if it's not clear that, he's talented enough to, get that volume at some point this season.
Right. Now, if you're doing it in round 4, it's a bit more of a risk than if you're doing it in round 12. But yeah, for sure. So now let's move on to a player that we've actually talked about on every show so far, and Stefon Diggs. So, Mike, what's your experience with Stefon Diggs in 2020?
So Diggs, I didn't want any part of him going to the Bills. I felt that there was going to be a lot of instability in his fantasy performances. I felt like there was going to be some big plays, but if you go to look what he did with Minnesota, like where he shined, right? In 2019, he led the NFL in deep yards in terms of passes that he caught that were over 20 yards, led the league in receptions, touchdowns, yards, all of it. Like he was the deep receiver for Kirk Cousins. Cousins was one of the best deep ball passers in the league in 2019. And then you look at Josh Allen, you say Josh Allen was legitimately maybe the worst deep ball thrower in 2019. And that's why John Brown really didn't blow up. John Brown, very, very good wide receiver, similar to Diggs in a lot of ways, where these guys are route running savants. They're not guys that are going to win 50-50 balls. They're not those Calvin Johnson type receivers. They're going to generate separation. They're going to rely on some accuracy, or at least the quarterback to be at least in the same timing, like in that same timing area as them. But John Brown, really, he had a high floor in 2019, but he never had a ceiling because they were not connecting on those deep balls. And then in 2020, what changed? It was Josh Allen, and that's another guy. I missed on my evaluation of him coming out of college because I didn't want him because I was like, quarterbacks seldomly get more accurate. Accuracy is something usually that you just have or you don't. And Josh Allen never really had it, especially when he played some of the top tier opponents in college. And I think we saw a lot of that throughout his first 2 years in the league. There was inconsistency in his play. He couldn't complete the deep ball. And it was like, all right, he has a big arm. We know he could throw the ball down the field, but it was similar to Cam Newton in a lot of ways where, Newton was a guy that really struggled with accuracy throughout his career. There was 1 year in there where we looked at him and he was the MVP, right? Where he kind of had everything click. Everything went together. Josh Allen had that year. He had that year in 2020. Now, will it continue? I'm not going to write off Josh Allen because Cam Newton only had 1 year of doing that. Because Josh Allen has progressed every single year. That's all you can hope your quarterback does is progress in the NFL. And so Diggs, I did a Twitter list. This is probably 2 or 3 years ago, where I posted my top 20 wide receivers based on pure talent alone. I had Amari Cooper in the top 10. People made fun of me about it. And I had Stefon Diggs as a top 10 receiver. People talked about it. And I said, if Stefon Diggs were to get as many targets as Antonio Brown did, I think you look at him like you look at Antonio Brown. I think that's how talented Stefon Diggs is as a route runner. Like the dude is just, he gets open against anyone. And so when you combine a guy like that, and then you combine the fact that Josh Allen took a step forward, and then you combine the fact that he's getting like 10 targets per game, Stefon Diggs was a superstar. John Brown was hurt for a little bit of the year. They threw the ball more than I think anybody anticipated them to. The running backs were not involved in the passing game at all. Dawson Knox did not take a step forward in his career in terms of getting targets. So everything kind of went Stefon Diggs' way in 2020. And I think that 2020 was a ceiling? I kind of do. Because again, Diggs is not the kind of guy that you're going to throw up to in double coverage and just say, I hope he comes down with this ball. He's not that guy. He's a route running guy where it's like Josh Allen. Do they let John Brown walk? That's one other question that we have about this Bills team. Because if they cut John Brown, they could save some money against the cap. Is John Brown older? Do they want to rely on him staying healthy? So there's a lot of things there. But ultimately, this one comes down to me just undervaluing Stefon Diggs as a player. And again, I loved him as a player, but I overvalued the landing spot. But this can kind of go both ways, though, too, where if you look at CeeDee Lamb, when he was playing with Dak Prescott, and then you see what happened to CeeDee Lamb once Dak Prescott was gone. You look at Devontae Parker with Ryan Fitzpatrick, and then you look at him with Tua Tagovailoa. And there's wide receivers that we could do this with all the time. But the difference is that I came back to, because again, I agonize over this stuff. I'm like, why did I miss? Why was I dumb about Stefon Diggs? And it was just me overvaluing the situation with a generational player. Devontae Parker's not a generational player. CeeDee Lamb, he was a rookie. I can't say that I don't know if he's going to be a generational player, but Stefon Diggs is that guy. He's that dude that he kind of transcends quarterback play and he's made it work. He just never got targeted in Minnesota. So it was like, how do the Bills view him? There were a lot of question marks surrounding Diggs. And do I regret not drafting him higher? I obviously do. Could we have seen it coming? As I was talking about, there's a lot of projecting that you kind of had to do, but at the same time, maybe we should have given Diggs the benefit of the doubt because he is such a special player.
Yeah, I think Diggs is probably better than even like his biggest fans would have told you coming into this season. He was just so good this year. I think, I mentioned it on a previous show, the fact that Buffalo gave up a first round pick for him should have told us a lot, because, teams don't give up first round picks for non-quarterbacks very often. So that was a signal. But I mean, really, it was the massive leap that Josh Allen took, which I don't think that really could have been predicted when you look at, even going back to his college stuff, and his first 2 NFL seasons weren't great. And then, Buffalo being so pass heavy was, of course, the other major surprise. So it all just kind of came together for Diggs.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately that ceiling was not all that foreseeable. I think also complicating it for Diggs was he was in this pool in ADP of wide receivers with similar, ranges of potential outcomes. So, Mike, looking forward, do you think that what happened with Diggs in 2020, ADP versus final production, do you think that it's going to alter anything for you next season and beyond, away from Diggs himself, but with wide receivers maybe moving teams or in terms of betting on talent?
Yeah, I just want to see a player again, I think I'll typically downgrade a player if he's switching teams naturally, because if you look at history, they've just generally, and especially in their first year, they underperform. But if you look at players like a Stefon Diggs, like an Amari Cooper, these guys I've used top 10 wide receivers in the NFL. So when they switch, maybe I shouldn't basically say that means as much as it should for another player, like where Brandon Cooks, for example, right? He's a guy that has done it before, where you see him produce with quarterback. Now, he played with a lot of great quarterbacks. Like Brandon Cooks, if you look at the resume between his career and then look at the career of someone like maybe like a DeAndre Hopkins, you're like, how good is DeAndre Hopkins? Because Brandon Cooks played with like some of the all-time greats. But he has done it year in, year out. Like he continually goes to a new team and he continually produces. So he is obviously a player that you don't have to worry about a switch so much. But again, historically, players switching teams, they're going to have a downgrade. And you have to look at the quarterback situation. You have to look at a lot of things. And again, Kirk Cousins excelled where Diggs excelled. And it was like, Allen struggled where Diggs excelled. And it's like, do these two mesh well, especially with no offseason, no workouts? They got to know each other on Madden. I mean, come on. Like, it's kind of ridiculous that the chemistry that those two built through a video game.
Mm-hmm. And I think, credit the Bills, because they used Diggs differently than how he was used in Minnesota in 2019. He was mostly a short range guy with Buffalo this past season. So, the Bills, I think, have kind of emerged as one of the smarter organizations in football.
Yeah, they used him differently by actually throwing him the ball. The last wide receiver on our list for this discussion is Keenan Allen, another player who came up in our Tuesday chat with JJ Zacharyson. Tell us, Mike, how Allen vexed you following rankings time in 2020.
There's a lot of similarities with him and Diggs. Even though Allen didn't switch a team, he had a lot of things going against him, right? He was playing for a team that was moving on from Phillip Rivers, their longtime franchise quarterback, a borderline Hall of Fame quarterback. On top of that, Keenan Allen was a guy that I think you'd have to go back like 5 or 6 years to find the last time he scored more than 6 touchdowns. So he was never a high touchdown guy, even with Rivers, who was throwing touchdowns. And then you're going to Tyrod Taylor, a guy that basically had never thrown more than, I think, 22 or 24 touchdowns in a season. They were going to become a more run-heavy offense because the defense was getting better and better. Obviously, they had some injuries again, but the stars were aligning for it to be a defensive-minded team with the offense just trying to play a ball control style offense, and therefore Keenan Allen was going to lose that 150 targets a year that he was basically seeing with Phillip Rivers. And again, a guy that has a low touchdown ceiling, okay. Matt Harmon will tell you, I mean, Keenan Allen's one of the better route runners in the league. He's a guy that they use all over the field. They use him in the slot, which is a mismatch for a lot of teams. But again, if your team is not throwing a whole lot, if you're not scoring touchdowns, it's like, what's the value of a target to Keenan Allen? So we had to downgrade him because of that. And then I said, okay, well, what if Justin Herbert takes over? Justin Herbert's a rookie. Justin Herbert was not a guy that like NFL teams were moving him down boards just because they didn't feel like he was ready to play right away. And to be fair, without that Tyrod Taylor injury, that odd punctured lung, he may have not played until midway through the season, and this is the guy that wins the Rookie of the Year. But I felt like even if Herbert were to take over, this team, they grabbed Brian Bulaga on free agency as to play right tackle. So it just identified that they wanted to run the ball. Even going back to the draft, they drafted Joshua Kelly. They had Austin Eckler. They signed to an extension. And it was like, this team wants to run the ball. They had Tyrod Taylor. And even if Herbert were to take over at some point because Taylor's struggling, if Taylor is struggling, that means Keenan Allen was struggling. So it's like, then they go to Herbert, a rookie who has no preseason action, who's playing behind an offensive line that I don't think has a starting caliber left tackle, which is a real problem for a lot of quarterbacks. And Justin Herbert, to his credit, I mean, that guy just outplayed all expectations. Again, even Herbert's biggest fan wouldn't tell you he would have did what he did, breaking the rookie record for passing touchdowns in 2020. So it's another one of those things where it's like overvaluing situation, I guess. But again, that's part of the stuff that we have to do as analysts, to go through and try and figure out, how many times a team's going to pass the ball. When they do pass the ball, what's the value of that target? What type of player is this? And all those things. So, and again, these cards were stacked up against Keenan Allen, and he just kind of overcame them. So, man, another player. He's a very, very good player, but again, I just didn't feel like the value of his targets were going to be the same, and I also felt his volume was going to come down. So having him ranked, I think I had him around wide receiver 24, 23-ish. It proved to be just far too low.
I mean, situation is so important, but you have to get that situation right. And I think, that was the biggest reason Diggs and Keenan Allen were misses. So I think as we look forward to 2021, it's like we need to find this year's Bills passing game, or like last year's Ravens or 2019's Ravens offense. Like if you can find that team that's going to either break out or just be different than consensus, like the Bills just passing so much more than expected, that's sort of where you can find big value, even if you're not projecting a specific player to do it. If you can just get the whole, pie from the team, that's a way to find some big league winners in fantasy drafts, I think.
And you just got to find the variable in there, right? Like you think the Bills, what was the variable? They got Diggs. The defense wasn't as good. Then you go to the Chargers, you find Justin Herbert. And so yeah, there has to be some sort of variable in there, whether it be a head coach or a massive impact player that was put on the team that would change it. But yeah, I'm with you. Hopefully we can find that this offseason.
Well, the other quiet variable in the Chargers situation was just offensive play volume. I mean, They jumped way up in total offensive plays last year versus the previous 2 years. They ended up with something like 130 more total plays than 2019, 180 over 2018. And I look back at my projections, they ended up throwing the ball about 130 more times, I think, than I projected. And it really wasn't a big difference in terms of pass run split. It was slightly more toward the pass, but it wasn't a huge difference there. So the play volume really made a big difference. And especially for Keenan Allen, who has been a little bit more volume dependent than some of the more explosive wide receivers.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, play volume, there's certainly a lot of luck in that one. And I wonder, with that specific category, Mike, we know that it's a volatile category. How do you handle play volume when you're projecting an offense in, spring or summer, whenever you're heading into the season?
Play volume is massive. I don't think people realize just how much that can mean to a player's projection. Because when you start going through that, like I have a sheet that I have running. It's a spreadsheet. Like I said, a million different spreadsheets. But when you pull them up, I have like 7 years tally now, where it's like 7 years running. And I look at the play counts and then like basically you're trying to project where it's going to go from there. And I don't think anybody could have projected the Chargers doing what they did this year. That's one of the major things, because, like Cliff Kingsbury, you knew his offense wanted to run more plays. Was the defense in a position where they were going to be better to the point where they could run more plays on offense? And I felt like, yes. So it's like naturally you have to do some projecting to get there. But the Chargers were one of those teams that you just couldn't do. But plays are a massive deal. And it's a lot of the reason why people, it's not that just we think Adam Gase is a terrible head coach. He is. But it's also due to lack of volume, because his offenses are continually, running 56 to 60 plays per game. And if you're doing that, you're capping. So even let's say it's 58, we'll put it in the middle of his coaching tenure, 58. Then you have a coach that runs 68. Like Doug Peterson was a guy that was running a ton of plays per game for a long time. So if you look at 68 and 58, that's 10 plays per game. That could be 10 targets. It could be 10 carries. It could be whatever. And then when you do that over the course of an entire season, you're like, holy cow, this stuff does add up. And that's when you're doing projections and you're trying to find decimal points, essentially, what you're doing. And when you have the more plays per game, it allows for more consistency, because you're not relying so much on that big play, and there could be a lot of volume to go around. So again, look for those coaches that have a tendency to running low play counts. These will be, I'm sure you guys are doing it. We'll be doing it, articles throughout the offseason highlighting, what teams run at a faster pace, which teams don't. And if you're stuck in a tiebreaker where you're like, I don't know who to draft, this player, I always lean towards the player that's going to be on a higher scoring team that's going to be running more plays. So, yeah. But again, going back to Anthony Lynn, I thought we had a big enough sample size of the type of plays they ran. And again, I thought it was going to be more of a ball control style offense with Tyrod Taylor. So, but again, the defense, losing some of their playmakers to injury, that obviously changed the path, and then obviously having Herbert drop back 40 times per game. But yeah, it's one of those things, if we can identify and we can correctly predict it, you can find a lot of value.
The Keenan Allen situation in particular has me thinking, so like at draft time last summer, I knew that I was a little bit uneasy with Keenan Allen as low as he was, and thinking, I mean, he's produced above this already. He might be ready to outproduce our ADP on him pretty easily. I just couldn't find that path because of what we've been talking about here. So I wonder if maybe one thing to do this summer is, after running through all the projections and doing the play counts for every team, maybe just do an exercise where it's like every team runs 1,100 offensive plays.
Yeah.
Let's alter the projections for that number just to see what could happen if, something unforeseeable happens and this team runs a whole bunch more plays. And I wonder if I had done that and, gotten Keenan Allen to that level, I've been like, oh, okay. So I don't need to necessarily find the path, just the what if that makes it possible for him.
Yeah, with the target share on a lot more volume. That might be a good best ball exercise to do.
Mm-hmm.
I think a good offseason project I might look into now is just figuring out how to better project play volume. Like, is it play caller? Is it quarterback play? Is it run pass split? Is it, just how good the team is or how good the defense is? I mean, I think being able to project that more accurately, as you were saying, Mike, is just so huge when you're doing projections.
Well, you can find his stuff, of course, on Fantasy Pros. And Mike, that includes a big article you recently posted, right? With a whole bunch of facts and recapping the 2020 season.
Yeah, I love doing that article. It's like, in season, the part I like about in season is you have like a method to your madness. Like if you were to ask me on Wednesday at 2:00 in the afternoon, what are you doing? I'd tell you exactly where I am, what I'm going to be doing every week. Now in the off season, it gets done and I'm able to kind of just go through a million different things that I didn't anticipate or I wasn't able to do during in season. And basically that article is my goal is to find so many stats, and it's 175 of them, where you might look in there and say, read a stat and you're going to be like, no. Like, I love it when people tell me I double check this just to make sure you weren't lying about it. That's the type of stat I want you to find in there. So finding 175 is really tough to do. But at the same time, it's like a scavenger hunt, trying to find the coolest things you can. So yeah, check it out. There's another older player that's coming off an injury, Julio Jones. He's been dropping in fantasy drafts, like the early ECR. Sometimes he's dropping outside the top 10 wide receivers, but people would be surprised to know he actually had his highest yards per target of his career in 2020, which is just, he's had a phenomenal career. Obviously the guy is, I think he averages 11% more yards per game than any other wide receiver in NFL history. So that's a major thing. Like there's a lot of shakeup on the Falcons this offseason, but that's one of those things that you see and you're kind of like, really? I know I was. So hopefully you guys are too.
Yeah, he definitely could be turning into an early draft value and a reason to jump into some best ball drafts right now. Maybe get Julio Jones when you can get him as late as round 4 sometimes. You can also find Mike, of course, the Fantasy Pros podcast, wherever you do your listening. He is on Twitter at Mike Tagliere with an E at the end, NFL. Thanks, Mike, again for joining us today.
No, thank you guys so much for having me. It was a blast.
Absolutely. You can, of course, also find us on Twitter. We are at DraftSharks. Jared is at SmolaDS. I am at SchaufDS. It's SCHAUF. For Mike Tagliere, Jared Smola, and the rest of the DraftSharks crew, I'm Matt Schauf saying thanks so much for swimming with us.